Hi, hello, friends, lovers, and enemies of the state. Which state in particular? The state of Maryland. So I haven't done a book review in a long time, but I always do book reviews of Hannah's books, and I finally finished reading The Love Song of Ivy K. Harlowe. For those of you who are new to the channel, you might not know that when I was like 13, I read an advanced reader's copy of Hannah Moskowitz's Invincible Summer, which is, to this day, probably my favorite book. I then found out that she was from like 15 minutes away from where I'm from, and then proceeded to spend like the next 6 years like lightly stalking her. Like I knew she went to UMD at one point. I knew she moved to Queens. And then eventually when she moved back to Maryland, I like reached out and I was like, I love your books. Like, can I take you to coffee? And then like we became actual friends because she's like very chill. And then like I convinced her to start a podcast with me about the L Word because I like bad shows. I don't know what to say. And now that we have finished watching the L Word, now our podcast is centered around watching Queer as Folk, which is taking forever because I keep forgetting to ask Hannah to record, and then we don't record. Anyways, I did, yes, give this book 5 out of 5 stars. This book is like a lesbian love triangle, except not quite, because it's really the main character watching her best friend who she's in love with fall in love with someone else. The main character's name is Andy, the person she's in love with is named Ivy, and the person that Ivy falls in love with is named Dot. And so basically the whole thing is that like Ivy is aloof and also very desirable and does not really sleep with the same person more than once and is essentially like the lesbian version of a fuckboy. But Ivy and Andy have known each other for like ever, and so like they're also best friends. So I'm gonna be totally honest, which is that I was actually very skeptical at first. Like, one, I love Hannah. I love everything that she writes. I think she really has like this awesome, very like snappy, very witty style that she writes in that I really like. Her newer stuff is definitely not as gritty as some of her earlier works, which is, I really like that like grittiness. There's just like so much angst in Invincible Summer. As someone who is like a very angsty young person, that still like really connects with me. I feel like it connects with most people, but I think Hannah doesn't really like writing in that style anymore. Granted, she is 30. Never mind. I'm gonna pretend I actually know her birthday. I don't. But I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like it because it's the newer style. Granted, I still really like Sick Kids in Love, which was the book that she published right before this one. I think I just like wish that every book could be Invincible Summer, but it can't. And unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. But the other reason that I was skeptical was because Hannah told me that her inspiration, what she wanted to do with this book, was that she wanted to take basically the premise of the first season of Queer as Folk and make it about lesbians, because there really aren't that many stories about queer people where we are not like the exception to the rule in terms of like the social group that the main character is in. Like pretty much every other queer book that I can think of, most of the characters were straight and like maybe a select few were queer, whereas in this book, everyone except for like the parents is queer, which is awesome. I think I was a little skeptical because, of course, like, if your source material is, like, super specific and you're trying to take something that you really love, because Hannah's seen Queer as Folk, like, a lot of times, probably about the equivalent of the number of times as I've seen the L Word, and she wanted to, like I said, make it to be a story about lesbians, and I was a little worried about, like, well, like, how is she going to be able to make this her own? Which, of course, she did. But it's, like, so subtle and so genius. Because, like, there are a lot of the same sort of character elements of the 3 main characters as there are in Queer as Folk, Justin, Brian, and Michael. Except the main character, Andy, is not as insufferable as Michael, thank God. And Ivy is way more sympathetic than Brian is, which I think like was so necessary in terms of like getting the audience on board with the characters in book format, because even in Queer as Folk you really don't start to sympathize with Brian until he goes to the prom with Justin after Justin pestered him. And in the book, Hannah knows that she needs to get you on board with Ivy as soon as possible. So, like, I think in the first chapter, maybe first chapter and a half, Ivy's house gets set on fire. And so now she is without a place to live. And so Andy's family takes her in, which is so important because it's a YA book. And if you kept with the same sort of trope of like Brian has sort of like the most social standing and like the most money and therefore like economic power and etc., 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 it makes it so much harder to connect with Ivy. And like you need a YA audience to really connect as soon as possible with the characters that you need them to get on board with. Like there's definitely a benefit to it being a very slow burn to like get on board with Brian and Queer as Folk, but it wouldn't have worked in this format. Also, it's definitely like way better to get to be in Andy's head as opposed to in Queer as Folk seeing everything from the outside. So Michael is so insufferable and he's such a jerk, whereas Andy, like, you see all the ways that she's being pulled, but also she's a very different character than Michael. She's just situated sort of within the story in the same position. And so, like, she has to take care of her family's failing business and also trying to, like, not be an asshole to Ivy because Ivy is really into Dot and certain things like that. You just get a lot more of like the internal process, which is so nice and so much better. I will preface that there is a tragedy at the end of the first season of Queer as Folk, and therefore there is a similar tragedy at the end of this book, and it's a very different one, and I would say that the one in this book is a lot more devastating. It's like really devastating. Like I almost cried, and that hasn't happened in a long time. Actually, that's so not true. I'm like pretty sure I did actually cry at the end of Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik because I liked that they were having happy endings. So what if I'm a little too sensitive? At least there's no water in my chart. I mean, it's such a great premise. Like watching a love story unfold from the outside while sort of still having stakes in the love story that's unfolding from within like the main character's perspective. It's very good. And the characters are all, you can see where the inspiration's being pulled from Queer as Folk, but these characters are very different. The archetypes are really just sort of what's the same. Like, I finished this book like 2 days ago, and I still feel connected to the characters. So, like, it's genuinely actually good. Like, when you feel, like, when you continue to think about the book or the characters in the book once you're done, and not in a way that, like, makes you angry, but makes you, like, really feel like you miss them. That's how you know a book is good, or at least how I know that a book is good, and I feel that way with this one. It's really good. It's really been, like, quite a while since I've done a book review, which is crazy. I just, like, kind of stopped reading because I was really feeling, like, a huge mental block, which does make sense. The collective trauma of the pandemic, plus, my job was coming to an end, plus I really, you could probably see it in a lot of my videos. I may have even said it in words, that I felt really unemployable, not just from like feeling like I don't have enough skills or whatever, to also feeling like I couldn't sustain work like a full-time job, like I would crumble apart. There's certain factors in there that may go away when I move, but then I also like applied to grad school, obviously, and got in, and like that whole process was so exhausting. Yeah, and I feel like I used to read a lot more, and then my dad and I got so hooked on American Ninja Warrior. But yeah, I just felt so like brain dead that I just spent a lot more time knitting and watching things as opposed to like reading or writing, which I'm trying to not feel bad about feeling mentally blocked on the writing thing. But everyone thinks that my creativity and energy will come back once I move, so fingers crossed. Oh yeah, and that's the other thing. I was like so just like exhausted after trying to find an apartment, having to go up to New York twice. But I am hoping to read more. I'm gonna be reading One Last Stop when I'm at the beach, so hopefully afterwards I can provide a review. So I should be doing some queer book reviews here and there, in addition to trying to work on a script. Oh, also very important for you to know, I'm in the acknowledgements page right there, right after Hannah's spouse, Benny. So yeah, I think this book is very good. It's very enjoyable. I think it's what a lot of us have been saying for quite a while, I think, at this point, about queer media not being representative. You know, it's usually like a handful of queer characters, if even a handful, and then most of the cast is straight, whereas this is, I think, a lot more accurate to like what your friendships look like as a queer person. I'm gonna give this 5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, highly recommend that you buy it and read it. It's very good. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. You can follow all of my social media down below. Feel free to like or subscribe or do whatever. And I will see you next time.
Whoa, whoa, Mamma Mia, here I go again. Why, how could I resist you? Mamma Mia, does it show?